Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and I know what you're going to say. Where the heck have you been? You know, I can't really tell you. No, just kidding. It's been crazy. So if you're new to this channel, welcome. If this is your first episode, I am so excited to have you here. If you've been with me for a while, if you've been with me from the beginning, thank you so much for sticking with me. I know it's been a rough ride for the last few months. I know I keep saying this. I'm going to do better. I promise. I am going to do better. And if you hear any screaming in the background, it's just my baby. She has finally found her voice and loves to talk. But anyways, moving forward, make sure you like and subscribe, and make sure you turn on notifications, because if you follow me at all, you know my posting can sometimes be sporadic. Hopefully, we will get on a much better schedule. School is almost over. All the kids' activities are almost over, so we should be able to post much more consistently. So make sure you turn on those notification buttons. And also make sure you're sharing this with those people in your life that you know would enjoy some history and some, true crime, creepy stories from history. Also, check out our website. It's just horriblehumansinhistory.com. You can listen to all the episodes there. You can also buy some merch. If you like our little logo, you can get some shirts with that on there. So check that out. And as always, if you have any recommendations for future episodes, please send them my way. I actually have a ginormous list of recommendations. I discovered just today that apparently Instagram has a "you must approve these messages" folder, and I did not know about that. And I found a ton of messages from some of you listeners. I am so sorry I never responded to you. I didn't know that you had messaged me and never notified me. So I should have responded to all of you. I have added all of your requests to my list, so we will be getting to all of the requests that I have. We've got quite a list now, and I'm so excited. Some of these look real good. These recommendations are fantastic. So keep them coming. Now that I know some of your messages are going to that folder, I will be checking it way more frequently. So keep sending in those recommendations. And again, I am so sorry to all of you listeners that probably thought I was just ignoring you. I wasn't, I swear. So anyways, today's episode is actually a recommendation from Jason. Thank you so much for this fabulous suggestion. And we are going to jump into it. So today's episode takes us deep into ancient history, into a story that overlaps with one of the most famous narratives ever told. So when you hear the name Herod the Great, what pops into your head? Is it the paranoid king from the Christmas story who ordered the slaughter of a ton of innocent babies? Or is it the tyrant who executed his own wives and sons because he saw them as threats? Yeah, Herod built some really cool stuff, but his reign was soaked in blood, fear, and heavy-handed control. So we are going to be talking about Herod the Great, the powerful paranoid king of Judea, most well known for the reign during Jesus' birth. So we're going to get into his true story. Let's get into this. So we have to go way back for Herod's story when it begins. Herod was born around 73 BC in the region of Judea. So he was actually from that area. His family had actually converted to Judaism a couple generations back, but many Jews did not accept them as Jewish. They saw them as outsiders because they were Edomites with Arab ties and a very strong Roman connection. So many Jews did not accept his family. So Herod grew up with brothers. They were named Faisal, Joseph, Pharoras, and his sister Salome, I think. They were pretty comfortable, but they lived in a pretty ambitious household, so they didn't live in poverty or anything. They lived in comfort, but his father, Antipater the elder, was incredibly politically savvy. He was a very sharp political operator. He became an advisor to the let's see if I can pronounce this correctly, Hasmonean rulers. He aligned himself with rising powers of Julius Caesar, so he knew which side to pick, basically. And through all of that loyalty, he gained a lot of influence in Judea. Herod's mother, Cyprus, is that how you say her name? She was a Nabatean Arab princess. Her marriage to Antipater, so Herod's father, actually helped create the alliance with Petra. Now, this is the foreign ancestry that made many of the Judeans view Herod as an outsider, and that was because he was half Idumean and half Jewish. So in the Jewish mind, he was an outsider. So Herod grew up in a world where power came from alliances and not heritage, which is very different than a lot of the people that we've talked about. It was all about who you knew, not necessarily where you came from. Now, this shaped everything about him. Herod's childhood was anything but peaceful. Judea at this very specific time in history was very unstable. That sounds familiar, right? Apparently that never goes away in history. They were caught between internal conflicts and Roman domination. So they had two powers kind of trying to vie for power in that area. Again, sounds familiar. Judea at the time, like I said, was super unstable. So from a young age, Herod actually learned that being in politics was very dangerous and that loyalty was very temporary and violence was necessary. So growing up in this, you could see where this might head for him in the future. By his teens and early 20s, Herod was already gaining power by leveraging his father Antipater's high-ranking Roman connections. So again, it's all about who you knew, not necessarily where you came from. In 47 BC, his dad received a reward from his pal Julius Caesar. Remember, he aligned very closely with Julius Caesar for political and military support during Rome's civil wars. And he was appointed to the position of procurator, or chief administrator. We're going to go with chief administrator of Judea. This actually allowed him to appoint his son, Herod, to a high-ranking position. So, I mean, technically it was where he came from. It was who his daddy knew. So, Herod's power really took off at this appointment by his dad because his dad was the governor of Galilee in 47 BC. Oh, wait, no, I got that wrong. Herod was appointed governor by his father of Galilee. Sorry. His father was a high-ranking official of Judea. Galilee is a smaller portion of Judea. Now, Herod's own early appointment was as the governor, or strategos military governor is the official title of Galilee. So this is the northern region of the Jewish territories. And this happened around the same time when he was in his mid to late 20s. His older brother, Faisal, received a similar role overseeing Jerusalem and southern areas of the Jewish territories. This was a classic family power grab by Antipater, who was effectively running things behind the nominal Hasmonean high priest / king, Hierarchus. So Hierarchus II, I know this is all very confusing. There's lots of different leaders, lots of different powers, but Hyrcanus II is the king / high priest of all the Jewish territory. So basically Herod's father is running this territory, but he's running it from behind the scenes. Now, Galilee at this point in time was basically a rough frontier zone full of rugged hills, trade routes that were plagued with bandits. They were often called, quote unquote, robbers or brigands. Brigadants. Sorry, guys. Oh, it's been a hot minute. I apologize. Just trying to get back in the swing of things. Hang in there with me. Anyways, so they had tons of bandits in these hills, not to mention all the pockets of resistance to Roman influence, and they were being very heavily taxed. The region had a reputation for being very hard to control, especially because there were a lot of caves in the area that were used by rebels as a hideout. So that area was a perfect place for all the rebels fighting against Rome to hide, because there were caves for them to hide in. And I also feel like you need, like I said, there's a lot of ruling powers in this area at the time. So I need to give you a little more context to the politics in the region at this point in time. And like I said, it is super complicated. So if this doesn't make any sense, you can just skip it and it's totally fine. I mean, you won't know what I'm talking about, but you can skip it if you want. So technically at this point, Jerusalem was an independent nation from Rome. They had their own ruling body, which at this point in time was called the Sanhedrin. They were the supreme Jewish council and the judicial body in Judea during the Second Temple period. That's where we're at in history right now. They were the enforcers of all the Jewish laws that the people were required to follow. They were very powerful, and you did not want to cross them. The Romans were the political leaders, but they tolerated the Sanhedrin because they typically allowed those that they conquered to keep their religions and their beliefs. So they're independent, but Rome still has power over them, if that makes any sense. So basically, the people are living in an area and they have to abide by two completely different sets of laws, the Jewish law and the Roman law. And they're being taxed by Rome. So like I said, it's very complicated. The Romans believed that they were the ultimate law. And like I said, they were tolerating the Sanhedrin. While the Sanhedrin believed that their law was above Roman law because their laws came from God. And sometimes, maybe a lot of times, these laws would actually clash and cause tension between the Roman leaders and the Sanhedrin leaders. The people who were stuck in the middle needed to abide by both or be punished by one or the other or both. And these punishments could include death. So it was kind of a tricky tightrope for these people to be walking. But this was normal life for them at this time. So there's the background. You need that context for what's happening. There's weird laws going on here. So let's continue back with Herod's story. So when he was appointed governor of Galilee, he crushed the rebellions brutally. He executed enemies without hesitation. He demonstrated early military prowess by suppressing local rebellions. So by his mid-20s, he was already showing that he was ruthless. When Herod took power, he didn't hesitate to take control over with ruthless efficiency. So he quickly organized a campaign against the bandit groups. The most famous target was actually a man named Hezekiah. He was sometimes called Ezekias, who was raiding all along the borders with Syria and causing trouble for Roman allied interests. So he squashed that super fast. Herod captured Hezekiah and had him executed immediately, along with many of his followers. There was no formal trial, no handover to the Jewish authorities, just really swift Roman-style justice. Now, this action won him very strong praise from the Romans, especially the governor of Syria, Sextus Caesar, and from Galileans that were so tired of these bandit raids. But now that this trade route was secure and security was improved, taxes flowed more reliably to Rome, so Herod gained an incredible reputation as a decisive, energetic administrator who really got things done. But I'm guessing you know who probably wasn't super happy about this. I'll give you a hint. He didn't hand him off to Jewish authorities. His actions actually sparked major backlash among traditional Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. Why? Why, you might ask? I mean, in Jewish law, as interpreted by the Sanhedrin, it required proper trials for capital crimes, especially for Jews. Executing these people without due process was seen as an overreach, huge overreach, and a violation of local customs. So they were pissed. They were so mad. And many viewed Herod as an outsider, like I had mentioned, and they saw him as imposing harsh Roman-friendly methods on Jewish soil. And it smelled like stuck-up occupiers to a lot of the Jewish people. Now, the high priest Hyrcanus II, again, he was technically the king at this time, with pressure from the Sanhedrin, he reluctantly summoned Herod to Jerusalem to stand trial for this unauthorized killing. Well, as you can probably guess, Herod didn't take this super duper well, so when Herod showed up to this trial, he was not this humble defendant seeking forgiveness, but he was dressed in royal purple. If you don't know the significance of that, that's just saying, I'm king, basically. I'm the ruler here, not you. He was dressed in royal purple, he was armed, and he was flanked by bodyguards. He showed up literally just to intimidate the court, and guess what? It worked. It turned out that most members of the Sanhedrin were too afraid to speak out or vote against him. So he didn't take it as like, oh no, how am I going to smooth this over? No, he was just like, I'm going to show them who's boss. I'm sick of this. There was one brave leader named Shemaiah who rebuked the others for their cowardice and warned that his fear would one day bring punishment on them. And guess what? That prophecy came true later when Herod purged all his opponents, like all dictators tend to do. Hyrcanus, who had Roman backing and didn't want to alienate powerful allies, intervened to let Herod off. Some accounts say Herod was technically acquitted, while others say he kind of escaped from punishment. But that one opponent did not stop him. He intimidated everybody else. So, feeling the heat from the Sanhedrin, though, he did flee for a little bit. He fled to Damascus and cultivated even stronger ties with Rome. So this call out from the Sanhedrin actually led to Rome backing him further. He was given additional responsibilities, including military command over parts of Colli and Syria and Samaria. So his power was growing because of this incident. Now, he quickly earned a reputation for being very ruthless and efficient. And like I mentioned, this really impressed the Romans, which ultimately solidified his Roman support. And he later became a, quote, friend of the Roman people. And that eventually would help him gain the title of king. But his actions made him feared by his own people. A lot of people were just terrified to oppose him. So the governorship of Galilee was Herod's launching pad into the rest of his career, basically. It proved his usefulness to Rome, and it built his military standing as well. And he had such an incredible reputation after governing Galilee. And it taught him a lot that results actually mattered more than local approval, because Rome actually had the power. They were the ones in charge. So Rome was so impressed at how he smashed the rebellion and put the Sanhedrin in their place that, with backing from powerful figures like, let's see if you recognize any of these names, Mark Antony, and later Augustus Caesar, I really hope you recognize those names, Herod would actually rise to tetrarch alongside his brother, and eventually he would be declared the, quote, king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. Oh, and I forgot to mention that this promotion came because his father was conveniently assassinated in 43 BC, which caused further civil wars in the region. But Herod and his brother were made the tetrarchs. And this was just a title, though. He still didn't have the kingdom yet, but he would take that by force, because the civil wars were happening. And remember, at this point, he still wasn't in Galilee. He had fled that area. But it was now time for Herod to return to Galilee. And at this time, it would be with the full support of Rome, which included legions, so massive armies led by General Gaius Sossus. Over the next few years, he conquered Judea. He was able to secure Galilee. He crushed all the resistance throughout the countryside. And he spent the remaining time eliminating pockets of opposition. So with that military support, he literally crushed the rebellion. Now, keep in mind, this just wasn't a normal war. It was a systematic domination from Herod. By 37 BC-ish, it's a rough timeline on this one, Jerusalem was the final prize to be taken. He had conquered every other land. He just needed to get Jerusalem. And he was ready to claim it for his own. So Jerusalem was heavily fortified and fiercely defended by antagonist forces. So Antigonus II was the king of Judea. We've talked about him a little bit. His forces and alliances posed the final and significant challenge to Herod's rise to power. So he was this close. He was so close to being fully in power. So part of the reason he was such a thorn in the side of Herod was because Antigonus was supported by the Parthian Empire. And of course, the local Jewish faction supported him as well. You know, it's those blasted Sanhedrin was supporting their king. And Antigonus resisted Herod and his Roman allies for 3 years. So they were able to hold Herod off for 3 years. So from 40 BC to 37 BC. Herod and the Romans did what they did best. They laid siege to the city in 37 BC. So Roman forces surrounded the city, and they were able to cut off all the supplies to and from the city. That meant that Jerusalem had no food. They were no longer able to get any reinforcements, and they desperately needed them from their allies. And there was absolutely no escape for the people inside. Herod and Sosius, his Roman military leader, camped outside Jerusalem, focusing specifically on the northern side, historically, which is the most vulnerable side of Jerusalem, as Pompey had actually exploited in 63 BC, which I will mention again in a second. The assault phase lasted roughly 5 months overall. The historian Josephus actually said that the defenders resisted with, quote, great alacrity and zeal, using the city's strong walls, towers, and their knowledge of the terrain. Josephus noted that they fought with brutish courage rather than prudent valor. As what typically happens during the siege in the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly, weakening their strength to resist Herod's takeover. In addition to their dwindling food, the Romans had actually built siege ramps and towers and battering rams, and they were constantly attacking the city. They attacked the city walls relentlessly. Now imagine the psychological trauma that this was probably causing, just constant bombardment. And yes, life back in those days was brutal for the common person, these poor people that were stuck in the middle of all of this. Now, this siege lasted for several months, possibly up to 5 months. Remember, they're not getting any food or anything into this city. Now, after about 40 days of intense effort, Herod's forces, with the Roman help, of course, overthrew part of the northern wall. 15 days later, the first outer wall fell, and then fighting continued into the temple area, and all of the area was burnt, and it was just complete chaos. And Herod's siege of Jerusalem overlapped with Yom Kippur, which is kind of important to know. That is, for Jewish people, the Day of Atonement, often referred to the Second Temple period, is when this was occurring. So it's interesting to note, because I mentioned Pompey also attacked Jerusalem in 63 BC. Their siege also overlapped with Yom Kippur, or the Day of the Fast, and it took place at the end of the sabbatical year. And in the 7th year, the land was not supposed to be sown or harvested, which caused a shortage of food during this fight. So I think that's important to note, that Jerusalem was already having a shortage of food because they were observing this religious holiday, but this made it so much worse because they were now under siege. So that's important to note, that this happened during one of their holy holidays, because as you can imagine, the people that were being conquered weren't super happy about their religious holiday being interrupted, right? But this was perfect timing for Rome, because they knew that the defenders were observing this fast, and they wouldn't have as much food. So it was weakening the city, and they knew that they literally had timed this perfectly. So they had a huge advantage. And eventually, after years of siege, the Roman forces breached the walls of Jerusalem. And then what happened when they entered was, well, obviously chaos. Roman soldiers flooded into Jerusalem and began looting everything they could find. They killed basically anyone from the city they came across and destroyed anything that they couldn't loot. Most of the ancient sources from this time described widespread slaughter. They would go street by street, and the combat was brutal. Josephus, the historian, painted this grim picture. Quote, all parts were full of those that were slain. They were murdered continually in narrow streets and in houses by crowds. No pity taken of either infant or the aged, nor did they spare so much as the weaker sex. So like I said, they were just killing everyone. And the Romans were especially furious at the long resistance and eager for plunder. So some pushed towards the temple's inner sanctum, echoing Pompey's earlier siege. So Pompey had also done this. Now, before they actually entered the city, Herod actually begged the Roman troops to stop and not kill all the people. And he even said that he did not want to rule a desert. So he wanted people to still be there. So they needed to stop. And basically their response was to say, well, soldiers will do what soldiers do. Like, soldiers will be soldiers. So Herod actually had to bribe them with his own funds to make the slaughter stop. And that seemed to have worked. So once the fighting was officially over, the king Antagonus was captured. Herod feared that Antagonus might still sway Roman opinion if he was taken to Rome for trial. So instead, he bribed Mark Antony to have him executed. And Antony had Antagonus beheaded in Antioch. That's a lot of A words. The first time that a Roman king or a Roman had actually executed a king in such a humiliating way. That was the first time they'd done that. And like I said, he was handed over to Mark Antony to be executed by beheading. And that was just so rare at the time. Now, this marked the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, which had actually been in power in that region from 141 BC to 237 BC. So a really, really long time. And now Herod was officially the ruler of Judea. But he did not stop with this victory. To ensure that his power was secure, there were no threats to the throne. He executed all the remaining supporters of the former king and all detractors that had every single one of them eliminated, all of his political rivals. Now that sounds really familiar, right? Every dictator ever has all their political rivals executed as soon as humanly possible. And he really tightened control over Jerusalem. He executed about 45 leading men from the antagonist party, and many of them were Sanhedrin members or elites who had opposed him. So this really helped eliminate immediate threats, but it actually deepened the resentment among the traditional Jewish leaders who already basically hated him and saw him as illegitimate. Now, on the conquering of Jerusalem, Herod showed you everything you need to know about Herod. He was deeply dependent on Rome for his power. He was more than willing to fight his own people to rule, and once he won, he ruled through fear and elimination of threats, like all paranoid leaders do. To add to his legitimacy, Herod actually married the Hasmonean princess, and her name was Mariamne. And she was Mariamne the First. And they got married shortly before or during the siege campaign. The timing's a little unclear on that. But this actually linked him very tenuously, but it did link him to the old royal line. So he could say that he, should be in line to be the king. Now, this marriage should have really stabilized his rule. And I'm sure you can guess what happened instead of stabilizing it. It actually fueled his paranoia, as all dictators tend to do. Herod became obsessed with maintaining his power. He feared betrayal constantly, even from his own family. And this is where things get dark in his story. Before, it was just he was a crazy leader trying to get power. This is where things take the horrible human turn. I mean, he was horrible before this, but it gets worse. So he had a fear of Hasmonean rivals and the court intrigue and all of that. He actually started on a path of killing that formed the darkest and most notorious parts of his legacy. He began by taking out threats in his own wife's family. His first target was Aristobulus III. It was actually his wife's 17-year-old brother. And in 35 BC, Herod appointed the strikingly handsome and very popular brother-in-law as a high priest. The crowds loved him and cheered wildly when he was officiating at the temple. But fearing that the people, and possibly Mark Antony himself, would actually favor the boy over him, Herod had him drowned in a swimming quote-unquote accident at a party in Jericho. He actually had his servants hold him underwater while pretending it was a playful roughhousing game. This kid was just 17 years old. Yeah. Then there was Hyrcanus II, who was his wife's grandfather, a former high priest. Herod had him executed by strangulation in 30 BC on trumped-up charges of plotting with the Parthians, even though at this point in time, this elderly man was basically harmless. He could literally do nothing. So he had him executed. And you also need to know a little bit more about his marriage to Miriam Nay. I swear it's only when I turn this on to record that I can't pronounce names. The marriage was politically brilliant. It was a very, very smart move. And like I said, he did it to legitimize his tie to the royal bloodline. But shockingly, this was a genuine obsessive love on Herod's side of the marriage. He loved her. He was very obsessed with her. However, she actually never forgave him for destroying her family for, some strange reason. I don't know why she wouldn't ever get over him destroying her family and her family's legacy. So he was obsessed with her. It didn't quite go the same way. Okay. So here are some key events that would lead to her death, because remember, he's super paranoid. So Herod left secret instructions with his uncle Joseph that if Herod died on campaign or was killed by Mark Antony, super suspicious of his friends, Joseph was to kill his wife immediately so no other man could have her. That's just so romantic. Oh. Anyways, his wife discovered these orders and was justifiably horrified that her husband basically ordered her execution if he died. She saw it as proof that Herod viewed her as property rather than an actual partner. So Herod's sister, Salome, who hated his wife, along with some other people, actually fed Herod rumors that his wife was conspiring against him and was cheating on him. One rumored plot involved a supposed poisoning attempt that was going to be committed. And, Herod's super paranoid at this point. So to get the truth, Herod actually tortured one of his wife's eunuchs, because that is a proven way to get the truth out of anyone. Torture, right? So her eunuch actually confirmed that she knew about the kill order that Herod had out on her. And this confession sealed her fate. This is when he was like, I know it. I knew it. She is plotting against me, even though he was the one who was plotting to have her killed. It seems so ridiculous. Anyways, she was put on trial, convicted, and the charges included attempted poisoning and disloyalty. Apparently, you can be put to death for disloyalty. And she was executed by sword or strangulation. The records are kind of mixed on that one. At around the age of 28 to 30, again, not super clear on her exact age, but it was in 29 BC that this happened. Now, weirdly, right after this execution, Herod immediately fell into deep grief. He would wander the palace calling her name and basically was acting like a crazy person. He nearly went completely mad. He supposedly had her body preserved in honey for some time while visiting her tomb and lamenting. He wanted her around still, so he had her body preserved. And some later historical accounts suggest darker, obsessive behavior with the corpse. And I'm going to let your imagination do the rest on that one. But the execution of his beloved wife marked a very large turning point, because after this, Herod's paranoia just spiraled out of control, because his next victim would be Alexandria, who was his wife's mother. After Miriam's death, Alexandra tried to seize power and complained to Cleopatra about Herod. So Herod had her executed around 28 to 26 BC. And from that point on, Herod would systematically remove all other threats. One of these threats was his two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. They were executed in 7 BC, so he killed his own sons. And his wife and him had at least 5 children, including 2 who became his favorite, like they were favored to become his heirs. And those were the 2 that he executed. They were raised with royal expectations that they would take over for their father, but they actually grew up resenting their father for killing their mother and her family. So he had some good reason to doubt their true motives, but they became very popular and outspoken, and they were very openly critical of Herod's style of rule. So Antipater, his eldest son, saw them as threats to his own succession. So this son was actually the son of his first wife. These other 2 boys were the sons of his second wife. But this first son did not like them. So he was constantly sowing suspicion with his father and even accused them of treason and plotting patricide. So Herod brought them before the Roman courts in 7 BC, and they were both convicted of conspiracy. So they were both executed by strangulation, and their bodies were buried at a fortress in Alexandrium alongside their grandfather. Now, their deaths actually cleared the path for this oldest son, but it horrified a lot of the people in Judea who had actually really liked these sons and thought that they could turn the tide and switch things up and make things better. Now, these family killings prompted Emperor Augustus, who knew Herod personally, by the way, to reportedly joke that, quote, "It's better to be Herod's pig than his son." Yeah, because you would more likely survive if you were the pig. And since Herod actually observed Jewish dietary laws and wouldn't kill pigs, his livestock was safer than his own kids. But don't worry, it gets worse. Herod didn't just target family. He ordered executions of political rivals, religious leaders, and literally anyone he suspected of disloyalty. So his rule became one of fear and control. And we have officially gotten to the part of the story that Herod is most well known for. According to the Gospel of Matthew, during Herod's reign, Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem. There were wise men that often were called magi that arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" And remember, that is his title currently, is King of the Jews. So that question terrified Herod because he was the King of the Jews. And now he's hearing that there is someone born that's supposed to be the King of the Jews. That's an immediate threat to his power. So he did what he always did when threatened. He chose violence. Herod allegedly ordered the execution of all male children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem. This event is known as the Massacre of the Innocents. And some historians debate whether this actually happened as described. No, there's no independent historical records outside of the Bible that this is exactly how it happened. But it really fits Herod perfectly. Knowing his personality and knowing what he's already done, it's not even shocking that he would do something like this. I mean, he killed his own sons. He would have no problem killing a bunch of babies. So he ordered the death of children to protect his throne. It's very believable. And honestly, it doesn't seem like something Rome would have a record of because the Jews made up such a small portion of their people. And since they weren't Roman people, in Rome's mind, they didn't matter. So their deaths were insignificant. So obviously, they're not going to keep a record of that. Now, according to the story, Jesus' family fled to Egypt and survived, so there was no point to this slaughter. Anyways, Herod, however, remained obsessed with control, even until the end of his life. While Herod did these horrible things, here's the strange contradiction with Herod. So he did lots of horrible things, but he also transformed Judea with massive architectural projects, which included expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. He constructed one of his most famous creations, which was Masada, a nearly impregnable desert fortress, and he began building entire cities. So his renovation of the temple in Jerusalem was considered one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. Ironically, he built this to gain favor with the Jewish people, who still largely hated him even after all these renovations. So, towards the end of his life, Herod's paranoia got even worse, if that was possible. On his deathbed, he ordered the Jericho Hippodrome plot. So, let me explain what that is. In his final agonies in Jericho, which was in early 4 BC, Herod ordered the arrest of many prominent Jewish leaders from across the entire kingdom. He locked them in the Hippodrome and instructed his sister and others to execute them all upon his death. So the entire nation would be in mourning rather than celebrating his death, because that logically makes sense. Now, his sister and her husband actually quietly released the prisoners after Herod died, which spared Judea one last massacre from Herod. And I'm sure you've been thinking that it's weird that his first son was safe from his father. All of his other sons got killed, but not so fast. In 4 BC, the same year as the Jericho Hippodrome plot and Herod's death, which we'll talk about in a second, he had spent years plotting against his brothers. And that finally worked. And once they were gone, he became the official heir and was sent to Rome with honors. But Antipater grew impatient and really wanted to take over for his dad. So he made a big oopsie mistake. He was caught plotting to poison or assassinate his father in some way. Oopsie. Bad choice. And while Herod lay dying in Jericho, this evidence emerged of his son's treason. So 5 days before Herod's own death, he ordered the Antipater, I think is how you say his name, be brought from the prison and executed immediately. His body was buried with his brothers. So he made a big boo-boo. He should have just waited because, like I said, it was just 5 days before Herod died. But this final act came when Herod was already racked with a terminal illness. It was called, quote, Herod's evil. It was likely a combination of gangrene, organ failure, and parasites. Yummy. I'm not even surprised he would be riddled with parasites. Anyways, he became increasingly unstable and cruel, and he died in 4 BC. Like I said, likely from those horrific illnesses. Now, historical accounts describe his symptoms as severe pain, rotting flesh, which they believe was gangrene. And some people believe it was a combination of these diseases that ultimately killed him. He died in Jericho, and he was hated and feared by most people. So it probably was a giant celebration when he finally died. And after his death, the kingdom was divided out to all of his remaining sons and the very people he had once tried to kill. So he didn't get all of his sons, and it was divided amongst all of them. Now, what was Herod's impact? Herod the Great remains one of the most infamous rulers in history. He represents dangers of unchecked power, how paranoia can take over when someone has absolute rule, and the brutality that's often hidden in political succession. And in Herod's case, power wasn't just something he held, it was something he clung to, no matter the cost. So, Herod the Great is our horrible human in history for the day. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I know that one was a lot and it could be a little confusing, but thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for sticking with me. I really do appreciate it. Make sure you're liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification button so when new episodes come out, you know about it, and share this with everybody you know. And make sure you tune in next time because we will be doing another listener recommendation, which we're going to do quite a few now. This one came from Jesse Greenfield. Thank you so much, Jesse. We are going to be talking about the infamous Hermine Braunsteiner. I think I said her name way wrong, but that's okay. She was the first Nazi war criminal to be extradited from the United States to face trial in Western Germany. So we're going to hear all about her and the horrible, awful things she did. So make sure you tune in next time to Horrible Humans in History. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next time.